Hello, welcome to the Energy Career Cycle. And today we're starting a new episode. We're going to be looking into a very important concept in the energy sector, and it's a bit more technical. In this episode and in this series, we're going to be looking into the challenges in Africa. We also start on some technologies that can help us and the role of those technologies to solve the challenges in Africa's energy sector. And today we're going to look into a very important thing. We're going to be looking into why does Africa still have an energy crisis in 2026. What we're going to be doing today, we're going to be looking into Africa's energy challenge. So this is an investigation that we are going to be working on together. Now, the reality check is that there are still about 600 million people in Africa who do not have access to electricity as it is in this year 2026. What this translates into is that 80% of the global energy access gap exists on the continent. Now, that's not small, because just imagine that in the entire world, 80% of those that do not have the required amount of access to energy are residents in Africa. That already shows us how energy poor Africa is. Yet, Africa has abundant solar, in terms of gas. In fact, when it comes to wind and also all renewable energy sources, 60% of renewable energy sources in the world are residents in Africa. And we also have very, fast-growing economies. But the question that we then need to ask ourselves is, why is the crisis still there? Now, it is not just about there is a lack of electricity, so it's not just electricity challenge. There are other things, because an energy crisis is not equal to the lack of power alone. Now, what an energy crisis does is that it's affected by three problems. One of them is the problem of access. Now, millions of people are currently not connected to the grid or to electricity in Africa. This is a problem. Now, also of reliability. Recently, I was speaking with some guys and I was telling them that in my books, the way I would define energy access is different from what majority of people, even those that have access to electricity today, are experiencing in Africa. I define that energy access or electricity access is different from grid access. Grid access is how it is currently being measured, but my definition is one that will tilt towards that of reliability. And if I go that way, the numbers will be higher than 600, because power outages occur in Africa. Many are affected, and you can still have a lot, power outages, as we still do in Africa, even when they are connected to the grid. So grid connectivity, but the reliability is still very low, and that in itself is a problem that we are still having to deal with. Also, affordability. So, because electricity is quite expensive for the African man. Now, oftentimes in the news, what we have is people are saying, look at how much Nigerians are paying. Look at how much Rwandans are paying. It's still very cheap compared to how much people in the US are paying. That's not the reality of things, because when you think about this, you also have to think about the purchasing power. How much do people in the US earn? Compare that to how much people in Africa earn. That's how you can know the true cost and the affordability level of electricity for many Africans. So even when connected, households truly do not fully have power access. So you can have grid access, but you do not have electricity access, as it were, in the real terms of having electricity running through the cables in your home. And there is a population trap, because electrification is losing the race against population. It is said that by the year 2030, Africa would have 1.5 billion people occupying the continent, if not more. Now, the progress that we then need to achieve in terms of meeting up with this rapidly growing number of population, we are not matching up to that, because about 19 million people gained access to annual electricity recently, and the progress that the world has enjoyed has been stalled by the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in Africa, because of the way we have not been able to deal with the development. In fact, reports have shown that the development that we achieved before COVID-19 days were eroded away because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so now there is a new demand for us to build our electricity access and build the infrastructure that can get those electricity access into our home. So there is a problem and we have to deal with it. Now, the population is growing faster and we need to meet up with the rate at which our population is growing, because a population that is growing without the resources to build the economy and feed that population is going to be a disaster if not properly managed. And we are not properly managing it as we should or as it is required as it stands now. So there is therefore also an investment gap. Now, what is this investment gap? Africa is underfunded massively. I told you earlier how that 60% of global renewable energy resources is resident in Africa. But then, do you know the issue? Only 2% of clean energy investment comes into Africa every year. Now, compare the underfunding that exists when it comes to transforming the resources into useful tools that can help us to build our economy. Africa needs, a lot of resources, but then when we check data, we'll see that there is a need for about $180 billion that Africa needs every year for universal energy access. That needs to be invested, for Africa to achieve universal energy access. Now, the current investment level is far below that because only about 2.5 billion per year is going into new connections in the African continent. So compare 180 billion to 2.5 billion that we are getting. That's a lot, a massive gap that we still need to close. So the biggest issue is that energy access is not attracting private capital enough. And the way we will do this is not that we will look externally. We need to be able to use the resources that we have on the African continent to get the investment that can help us to build the infrastructures and also close the gap for our energy access in Africa. Now, there is also an infrastructure problem, as I mentioned, because currently we have a lot of outdated and weak power systems. A lot of them are not functioning at optimal level, and we need a lot of resources to go into them. So many grids are old, many are under maintained, many are, even urban focused. And that's an issue because those in the rural communities also need electricity access. In fact, given the history of Africa and many of our food crops being produced in rural communities, these rural communities need the electricity on the energy access for them to be able to process and preserve the foods that are being produced. I can tell you, a report showed that about 56% of agricultural produce in Nigeria alone, this statistics has to do with Nigeria, 56% of agricultural produce in Nigeria alone are lost every year because of why they are not properly managed. So that cold chain that will be able to keep them and sustain their shelf life is not present there. And we cannot have that if there is no infrastructure. And we cannot have the infrastructure alone if we do not have electricity access to even support the infrastructure. So we see that there is an electricity access gap. There's also an infrastructure gap. And this is affecting not just the cost of food, it's also affecting the rate of development even in other sectors in the African continent. Now, 80% of unelectrified people live in rural areas, and so there is a lot of effort that still needs to go. Now, remember I told you that 600 million people do not have access to electricity. Now, 80% of these people live in rural communities. This therefore means that majority of the effort that needs to be put into our energy access campaigns and projects has to go into the rural communities, and the result is that we have frequent blackouts, and limited expansion capacity, which we need to deal with. Now, that leads to what is called energy inequality. Africa now does not just lack, energy; it lacks fair distribution, because take for example, Africa is 90% of global population, but only 3% of global electricity use. That's a challenge. So you can look at the problems that we have in Africa, and you can see how much energy are we consuming, and you can use that to determine how much productivity we have in the African continent. Because if we have just 3% of global electricity use, you can tell how much electricity we are even consuming and how that will impact on our manufacturing level. So we are manufacturing less. We are manufacturing very little. If we consume just 3% of global electricity use, then you can tell how much manufacturing we can make from just 3% of global electricity use. And because we are not manufacturing enough, that affects our economy, the African economy, national economies in myriads of ways. And this needs to be addressed. Now, within countries, you see that cities have even better access than the rural communities, and rural areas have energy poverty, and that you have energy inequality even within the African continent. So while we have some places that are very energy poor, we have some places that are fairly energy rich, compared to others, and some countries are better than others. But this disparity is where we have the challenges that we still have in the African continent in terms of our manufacturing, in terms of our industrialization, our agricultural produce. And so it means that several aspects of our economy are not performing optimally because we do not have the right infrastructure, we do not have the right systems in terms of inequalities now, and we do not have energy access and the financing that is required to support our energy access expansion project. So another thing that we also are currently seeing on the African continent is an affordability crisis, right? Now, even when power now exists, people still cannot afford it. Now, this is because electricity tariffs are rising faster than the incomes of people. I've explained that to you. And so energy poverty is now therefore equal to an income problem and an infrastructure problem. So energy poverty, people who are energy poor do not have the income to purchase it, even when it's available. But for it to be available, you need to be able to collect enough tariffs and be able to use the tariffs that you're getting to invest into the infrastructure. And because people cannot pay properly as they should, you also have an infrastructure problem. So the projects are not bankable, even if they were to be financed privately. And so we see that there is an interconnection between the problems that we are having from the social aspect to the economic aspect, and then the technical aspect, which is the infrastructure aspect that I had mentioned. Now, so many households still rely on, say, maybe diesel, kerosene, and firewood, and the energy transition is not happening as fast as it should on the African continent. We also have what I would call our policy and governance challenges, because this is an hidden issue that most people would ignore. And what we have is our weak regulatory frameworks. And you can have regulatory frameworks that are not composed to the context of the people, or do not work based on the culture of the people there, because regulatory frameworks that we have adopted from places like the US or maybe even Europe cannot really function in the African environment. It does not work that way. And so you have also poor utility performance and limited long-term planning. We do not plan for the long term in the kind of project that we are doing. We need to start thinking about these things, and also we have policy inconsistency that therefore scares investors, because no investor would put his money into a project in an environment that the policy does not ensure long-term planning and long-term project implementation, can also assure that this investor would get his investment back, and also the interest on investment. So the result is that projects do not scale. This is a problem and needs to be solved. Now, the real truth is that African energy crisis is not a resource problem. Like I told you, we have a lot of resources. Africa does not lack energy. What we need is systems that would deliver the project from resource to useful energy. And then I put it that way. Now, so it is a financing problem, a governance challenge, an infrastructure gap, and also a system design problem. So, but then, while we have looked at all of these problems, is it that all we have in the African continent are problems? No, things are changing. There is hope. And as I round this up, I want to share with you what the hope looks like, because we have a solar boom. There is a record growth, and Africans can make use of this because we have high radiation almost across the continent. all through the year. Take for example your Nigeria, your Ghana, they have high irradiation all across the year. And so mini grids and microgrids are scaling up across the continent, and this is an opportunity that African can make use of, and we can use to scale our economy and close the energy access gap that is currently ravaging the continent. And also policy reforms like the Mission 300 are some of the things that are coming into play for us to put the systems that we need into place and solve the problems that are currently ongoing. So the opportunity is bigger than the crisis, but it needs you and I for us to be able to solve this. I hope you have learned something on this episode of the Energy Career Circle, and I will see you on the next one, where we share more on how we can solve the problems, the technologies that we can use, and the role of you and I in solving these problems. Thank you.
Energy Career Circle, featuring Ayodeji Steven.